Hello and welcome to my first ever tutorial. Today I will be showing you how I make these abstract cosmic skies in watercolor. I'm still a beginner watercolor artist, and this has been a really fun way to learn about water control and different textures that you can achieve by using salt and spattering effects. Here are the colors I will be using for today's mini paintings. I used mostly Daniel Smith watercolors and a few pigments by Holbein. You don't have to use these exact same pigments, so feel free to use whatever colors you want. These are just color combinations that I personally enjoy using. So for the first painting, I'll be using Opera Pink, Quinacridone Purple, and Carbazole Violet. For the second one, I will be using Cerulean Blue, Phthalo Blue, French Ultramarine, and Payne's Gray. For the third one, I will be using Hansa Yellow Light, Viridian Hue by Holbein, and Payne's Gray again. Then for the fourth painting, I'll be using Hansa Yellow Light again, Vermilion by Holbein, Alizarin Crimson, and Lunar Black. And for the stars, I will be using Zinc White Gouache by Winsor Newton. And you can use any kind of watercolor brush that you like for this. I'm using a 1/2 oval wash brush by Princeton because I like how it comes to a point for dabbing in little dots of pigment. And my watercolor paper of choice is 100% cotton Arches cold pressed paper. I've taped the watercolor paper down on a drawing board using artist tape and divided it into 4 quadrants. I like doing 4 paintings at a time because the more I paint, the more I improve, and I can do slightly different techniques with each one and see which effects I like in the end. I start the first layer of each quadrant with a wet and wet wash, so I wet the paper fully with clean water. I don't want it to have any visible puddles, but it has a pretty thick layer of water on the surface to allow the colors to spread out and do cool things on their own. Using some diluted Opera Pink, I start to paint in a squiggly motion around the center, being sure to leave some white space to create that cosmic effect of bright stars bleeding into cosmic dust, like you see in photos of galaxies like the Milky Way. Then as I paint outward, I add more pigment to create a gradient from light to more saturated color. Now I'm adding some Quinacridone Purple to the mix and blending it into the Opera Pink a bit while moving outward towards the edges. And then I add some Carbazole Violet to the very edges of the painting to show the cosmic clouds fading into the void of space. I drop in a few more dots of concentrated pigment, which will slowly spread to create interesting textures and increase the saturation of the pink. And now I'm sprinkling salt along the center to create some texture in the clouds. This will create some neat effects once the paint dries. Finally, I spatter some opera pink all over the painting, trying to mostly avoid the white space in the center. If some of it gets into the white space, it's not a huge deal. You can just dab it with a bit of paper towel to lift the paint. Spattering the paint like this creates more interesting textures and helps make it look more like clouds and dust rather than a smooth river of colors. For the second painting, I do the same thing where I paint around the white space in the center using wavy motions with my brush, this time starting with cerulean blue. The color around the white space is the lightest, with the pigment being pretty diluted with water, and then I use more concentrated pigment as I move outward. I then add some phthalo blue and ultramarine to the mix to make it a more concentrated blue. And finally, at the outermost edges, I add in some Payne's gray so that the cosmic clouds fade into the darkness of space. Again, I sprinkle some salt around the white space, and then I'll spatter in some cerulean blue all around the painting. Now I'm going to speed up the video into a time lapse for the last two paintings, since I'm pretty much doing the exact same process, just with different colors. For this one, I start off with Hansa Yellow Light, then add in Viridian and Payne's Gray. Then I spatter Hansa Yellow Light all over the painting. And for the last one, I start off with Hansa Yellow Light again, followed by Vermilion, and then finish with Alizarin Crimson at the outer edges. I hold off on the Lunar Black for now because I don't want the painting to get too dark in the beginning. I usually wait to use black for the third or fourth layer so that there's a nice buildup of color first. Now everything is completely dry, and you can see the neat effects caused by the salt and spatter. Salt creates these neat starry textures, and the spatter creates little glowy splotches. Now it's time to brush off the salt. At first I use my fingers to get the more stubborn granules off of the paper. And then I use a crappy brush that I don't use for painting to clean off the rest, so I don't scratch up the surface of the paper. I try to avoid leaving any salt on the paper because it can cause back runs and all kinds of weird things, so it's best to try to get off as much as possible. The rest of the painting process will be sped up again because I'm doing the same thing pretty much over and over again, just building up the colors and letting the watercolor blend and flow to create neat effects on its own. You'll notice I wet the white space in the center first before painting color around it for the second layer. First layer was wet on wet, and the layers after that I paint wet on dry. By wetting the center first, the color will subtly blend into the bright whiteness of the center of each painting instead of creating a hard edge. It becomes a very meditative process at this point, just watching how the water and pigment create their own interesting shapes and textures. Now the second layer is dry, and you can see how adding more salt and spatter with each layer constantly changes how each painting looks after it dries. I'm really liking how this one is turning out with the different textural effects. Watercolor is such a magical medium, and I love seeing how every painting completely transforms with each layer. With the third layer, I'm doing the same process with more concentrated pigment, gradually building up the saturation and contrast. I don't add salt as much after the second layer because I kind of want to preserve the textures that the salt already created in the first two layers. Even though I'm painting over them, the texture will still show through in the end. Another aspect of texture in these paintings is the granulating effect of the pigments I'm using. The ultramarine and Payne's gray are pigments with higher granulation, which adds another layer of texture with each wash. I love adding granulating pigments wherever I can because they do really cool things, especially when painting galaxies or seascapes. When you see my brush hand go off screen, I'm either picking up more pigment, washing my brush, or dabbing my brush on a towel to remove excess water or pigment. Water control is one of the most challenging things to learn with watercolor and takes a lot of practice. If you're experiencing a lot of backruns or cauliflower effects, try dabbing your brush on a towel every time you pick up some water. I often squeeze out my brush too after rinsing it and picking up clean water because these Princeton brushes hold a lot of moisture. If you're still experiencing back runs and funky things, even though you're using 100% cotton paper, just have patience and keep practicing. It's taken me nearly 2 years to feel like I have some level of control with the paint to water ratio when painting with watercolor, and it just took a lot of experimentation and practice. Now we're at the 4th layer and I'm finally adding black to my palette. I know a lot of painters avoid black or try to create a dark, almost black color by mixing other darker pigments together, and I often do that as well. But for space-themed paintings, I often use a little bit of black because it creates a lot of contrast and makes it more realistic since the void of space is pretty dark. I also like Daniel Smith's Lunar Black because it has a little bit of granulation, which adds even more texture. So with this final layer, I'm really trying to push the contrast with the darker, more saturated pigment, adding more Carbazole Violet, Payne's Gray, and some Lunar Black to this first painting. And then for the second painting, I add more ultramarine, Payne's Gray, and Lunar Black. And then for the third painting, I add more ultramarine and Payne's Gray to the Viridian, plus the Lunar Black to the outer edges. I still spatter in the 4th layer because it gives that effect of cosmic dust projecting outward from the center of the galaxy, nebula, or whatever cosmic body that you're painting. And then for the 4th one, I'm adding more crimson and blending a little Lunar Black into the crimson at the outer edges. The fourth layer is now dry, and I'm satisfied with the contrast of the first three paintings, but I want to add a little more to this fourth one by adding more pigment. I push the contrast by adding more saturated alizarin crimson and lunar black. I also sprinkle in a little salt because I'm curious what it'll do for this final layer. Now you can see how the buildup of salt, spatter, and granulation has created visually interesting textures and diverse shapes. Now that the paintings are finished and completely dry, it's time for the final and most satisfying part of cosmic paintings, adding the stars. Using a small brush, I pick up some white gouache with a little bit of water and then lightly tap it against another brush to randomly spatter white dots all over the painting. The first few drops are pretty large and slowly decrease in size as the paint thins out. Sometimes the drops are a little too big, so I dab them with a damp piece of paper towel to lift them up. This causes a little white smudge at first, but it usually blends in once it dries. And then to better imitate the random placement of stars in a galaxy, I use a cheap toothbrush that I only use for painting to flake more scattered white stars around the paintings. I lightly brush my finger along the bristles of the toothbrush to achieve this effect. I suggest practicing this first on a scrap piece of paper that has some pigment swatches on it, so you can figure out the right speed and pressure to apply while doing this, because it's a bit tricky to master. The velocity is a lot different compared to tapping it with a brush, so I have to be more careful about flicking slowly and lightly. And finally, I use a white gel pen to add a little more definition to the stars. I'm keeping these pretty simple with a few sparkle-shaped stars, and I fill in a few of the lighter dots so that they stand out more. You can have fun with this and experiment with different star shapes and various sizes. And now we're all finished. It's time to remove the tape and admire our work. I hope you enjoyed painting with me and learned something new. I painted many of these cosmic skies, and they're always a fun way to practice with watercolor. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to bring you more tutorials soon. Bye!